Thank you very much, Lynn. Thanks a lot, Imran. First, I would like first to thank you for this invitation, which is both a pleasure and an honor. And to some extent, to apologize that I have to do it online because I think it would have been much better to be there in person. I do, however, hope that possibly next year it would actually happen. I've gotten used to presentations in online. I see that there is a very good attendance, so there is something to be said in favor of that, but I think they cannot fully replicate or replace in-person presentations. Having said that, let me try first to share my slides, and then hopefully to go over the presentation. I will be speaking for about 35 to 40 minutes. I want to let you know that in advance, so if you become a little bit impatient, you know the end is near. And I would, the slides actually exist. I mean, I send them, so they would be there. You can actually access them, but I will not cover all of them simply because there are simply too many. Well, this is, it starts as a very sort of a general view of what happened to global inequality over the last 200 years. I will be very brief on this because obviously that can take a whole lecture just sort of explaining the methodological choices and the data issue that we had in working on that. I have, this is a nice quote from Fernand Braudel, essentially saying that the structural realities are very slow to take place and also to fade away. And this is indeed what we find in not only in global inequality, we find it in inequality itself. I read Professor Volodia's paper like recently that was published in a South African journal, and indeed with now, as Lynn said, with high, probably South Africa having one of the highest inequalities, it is not very easy, even if the policies were different, it's not easy to change things and to reduce inequality. So I would, when I show you in a minute the shape of global inequality over the last 2 centuries, I have to say that it relies for the period from 1820 to the 1980s on a seminal work by François Bourguignon and Christian Morisson, who actually did that originally in the early 2000s, and that work has been somewhat updated by myself using the new GDP data for the historical period. The results are basically the same either way, but what really is important to realize is the following. If we start with an attempt to estimate global inequality, which I forgot to define, is inequality between world citizens. So you treat the entire world. In those days, you know, post-Napoleonic wars, we are talking a little over 1 billion people. Nowadays, we are talking about 8 billion people. Technically, you take incomes of all of them, take them in local currency, convert them into so-called PPP dollars, which in principle give you the same purchasing power everywhere. So that, for example, incomes that are received in South Africa or India or Brazil or countries that have lower price level than the US. US is used as a numeraire. These incomes are boosted up so that actually you do acknowledge the fact that maybe if you have to buy, you know, rice and tea in India, it doesn't going to cost as much as in Norway. So that's how it is in principle done. Now, obviously, we don't have data for 8 billion people. We use for the more recent period household surveys that are nationally representative for about from about 130 countries. I have to actually say that South Africa has been very good in that respect. I'm also involved with Luxembourg Income Study, which receives all these surveys. With South Africa, we have never had problems, and actually the delivery of the data is quite good. The South African problem, as you know, is high inequality, but not as much the data provision. So how does global inequality look when you look at this kind of really very broad picture? It actually goes up throughout the whole 19th century. It is driven by increasing gaps between the countries in the north, essentially North and Western Europe and North America, and stagnant or even declining incomes in India and China. Now, at that time, Africa doesn't play that much of a role. Africa is poor, but it doesn't get poorer than it was, and it's relatively small in terms of population. I will come at the end of my talk to a point that was mentioned before, really increasing importance in Africa now, and actually yet more increasing importance in the rest of the century. Now, the second period is the period of after World War II and US dominance, when you have essentially the world divided into three worlds. The first world of developed and rich capitalist countries, the second world of socialist countries with lower income, and the third world that basically includes Asia and Africa, and to some extent, most of Latin America. So that's the world with extremely high inequality. You see the Gini coefficient here of over 70. So if you were to take South Africa as a representative of the world, to some extent it mimics the world, inequality then was even higher than in South Africa, which is not surprising. Obviously, the world includes everybody. But what is interesting is from around the turn of the 21st century, you have a decline, and I have to really emphasize that, a decline in standard measurement of inequality using the Gini coefficient, which is on the vertical axis. And that decline comes as a result predominantly of China, of Chinese growth, but also of India, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and so forth. The basic line here, and I will not talk about that much more because I think it should be intuitive, is that you have very large countries that start the period of the 1980s and onward with being large, of course, in terms of population, and being relatively poor. So what happens in the next 40 years? They, and China is paradigmic case, they simply grow faster than the poorest countries and the richest countries. And since that middle becomes more important, they actually reduce global inequality measured by the Gini coefficient. And I will talk about that really in a minute because I would focus on the past 30 years. Now, you can also break this global inequality into two components. The blue component is inequality between countries, and the orange component, inequalities within countries. Now, without going through all of these individual data points, let me just point out to the general tendencies. In the 19th century, the blue component goes up simply on account of rising gaps between the global south and global north. Let's put it in today's terminology. In those days' terminology, it was different. It was really the rising differences between essentially countries of Western Europe and North America and India and China, as I said before. But notice also in that period the rising orange bar, which indicates increasing income inequality within countries. So you had, and obviously Marx is a perfect example of that, you had rising inequalities within nation states, and on the other hand, you had rising inequalities between nation states. And these two forces were both pushing inequality up. So then you have this very long period of almost like, more than 50 years of extremely high inequality, where the red bar starts shrinking because of the reduction of inequalities in the West, because of communist revolutions in Eastern Europe and previous in the Soviet Union and China that all reduced inequality within countries. And you have still a very high level of between country inequality, the blue bar. And then what happens in the latest period is the blue bar shrinks on account of the rise of Asia, and the red bar goes up a little bit because of the rising inequalities within countries. So notice now, and this is actually, I think, a very succinct summary of what's happening today, is that you have rising gaps within nation states and diminished gaps between the countries overall. That does not mean that each individual country is behaving exactly like that, but the blue bar is really determined, and the decline in the blue bar is driven by the rise of Asia. To some extent, the rise of Asia is like the mirror image of the rise of the West. The rise of the West took place where income differences between countries were very small, and then the rise of the West made income differences between countries large. The rise of Asia is the mirror image because it starts at a position where the differences between countries are very large, and basically because of the rise of a relatively poor continent, it reduces these differences. So I think that the dynamic of what happened, I think, is important to keep in mind, and not to actually, when we speak of inequality, believe that inequality must increase or is increasing in all the different dimensions. In the population weighted between country inequality, it is certainly going down. And then, of course, it can be seen also by using GDP data. So I will not go over this graph. The GDP data also are annually available, and you do the weighting by the size of the population, and they show you more or less the same trends. So this is what I call now the greatest reshuffle in relative income positions. I have to point out, you will show that in a minute, but what reshuffle is, what I mean by reshuffling, is that the top 20% of the world, in terms of individual incomes, has essentially been, quote unquote, occupied by the people from the global north for the last 2 centuries. What is now happening is that people from Asia, not only because these countries have high growth, but because these countries have also lots of people, are entering into that area. And when they enter, since we are talking about rankings, what happens if somebody who was maybe at the 75th percentile of the global income distribution gets overtaken by somebody who was below him or her, and then that obviously means that you cannot stay at the number 75, you have to go down. And this is this reshuffling in individual positions, which also reflects the reshuffling in economic power and a position between Asia and essentially the global north. So here is another example by using GDP. I'm always talking on PPP terms because I adjust everything for the purchasing power, as explained before. China overtook the US, it is well known, in 2015. So the graph on the left is sort of been used before, but the graph on the right is even to some extent more striking, compares the size, and both graphs compare the size of the two economies. In the graph on the right, you compare the size of India versus Germany, and notice that, for example, in 1980s, Germany represented about 7% of the global GDP. India represented less than 3%, or actually produced less than 3% of the global GDP. The proportions are entirely different now. India is producing 8% of the global GDP, and Germany is producing 3%. It does not mean that Germany has declined. As you know, in absolute amount, Germany did not decline, but Germany grew much slower than the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is basically determined, the growth comes from large Asian countries. So that particular feature that you can see in the case of Germany, the decline in the share, will be then seen in individual incomes of German citizens whose relative worldwide position has also declined. Now, what did the rise of Asia sort of accomplish, if you will? You can see it kind of nicely on this stylized picture, which shows you density of distributions in 3 years, 1988, 2008, and 2018. And the 1988 period begins with really lots of population in the world. And again, China and India predominantly, at a very low level of income. As you notice that the mean of that large peak, the point of that large peak is about $500 or $600 per year. So we are talking about $2 per day being the first peak. And what happens is that the distribution shifts rightward, which means that incomes increase. So that's what the rightward shift implies. But on top of that, notice the very important phenomenon, which is the rise on the middle. So in 1988, you have kind of emptiness in the middle. And I remember when I did my first book on the topic, it was in the early 2000s, it was called The Worlds Apart. And it really highlighted that bizarre situation where the middle of the global income distribution is kind of empty. And it was empty because you had a very big peak on the left with low incomes. Again, India, China, lots of Asia. And then you had another smaller peak of very high incomes with Western countries. Well, that has really changed. The shape has significantly changed. And as you can see, this green line looks almost like a log normal distribution. The x-axis is in logs, and it kind of looks like a normal distribution. It's still not a normal distribution. It is still skewed to the right because you have very high incomes at the end. I mean, top 1%, top 2%. But it almost looks like a distribution of an individual country. So that really happened over a historically short period of time of 30 years. However, the picture is not only bright. The large gaps remain. And for example, if you take China out, which of course played a crucial role in what you can call the relative convergence of incomes, if you take China out and put everybody else, call it periphery, and take the rich world of North America, Europe, Oceania, and Japan as the core, you notice that the distributions of the two are quite different. Relatively few people from the periphery, which means the rest of the world, are having incomes that are above the median of the core countries, and almost none from the core countries has incomes below the median of the periphery. And the ratio is all in PPP terms. The ratio of the medians is 8:2. So one should be very careful. One should be applauding and be happy that, I think, in principle, that we have had a sort of the creation of something that I call the global median class, that we have the much more people in the middle, that we have had a very good period of growth over the last pre-COVID. I'm talking about 30 years pre-COVID. On the other hand, the gaps are still enormous, and some parts of the world have really not benefited much in terms of income, nor in terms of convergence. And if, for example, the convergence between the periphery and the core were to continue at the rate at which happened over the last 30 years, again excluding China, it would take 3 centuries for the periphery to have enough population above the income of the current income of the median income in the core. So it would take 3 centuries for some kind of convergence. So it is really a snail's pace in some ways. And I think that's why we should keep these two pictures at the same time. Yes, there was a convergence. China played a crucial role, but parts of the world were actually exempt from that. And I think Africa in particular was exempt from it. And of course, when you use market exchange rates instead of PPPs, that gap becomes, multiplied, and it becomes 22 times. So essentially, the gap becomes enormous. The average income, the median income in the periphery is, 122 parts, so it becomes like 4% of the income in the core. that was at the market exchange rates, which of course are not giving you the real purchasing power, which is greater in the periphery than indicated by a market exchange rate, but it is still useful, to keep in mind. I would then now move to the more recent period, which is first characterized by the graph that many of you have seen. This was the so-called elephant chart. I would go very briefly over that because I think it has been discussed and over-discussed. It essentially showed during the period of high globalization, it showed very high income growth in the middle of the income distribution. The fact that you have already have seen already, because it was implicit in the graph that I've shown before. It has shown a low growth of the Western middle classes. That was the point B, and that was, of course, the political issue in many countries. And finally, at point C, it shows very high growth rates among the top 1%. So this is, I think, the importance of this graph was a political importance, because it became very popular in rich countries, highlighting the fact that the middle classes in those countries have not seen much real growth during the period of high globalization. And that, of course, is in sort of a distinction to the very high growth seen, experienced by the top 1% in those countries, and also by very high growth among middle classes in Asia. So that, of course, graph then led you to a political dilemma. If you really in the West want to improve the position of the point B, should you improve it by taxing point C more, or should you improve it by changing globalization as it's happening now to make China grow less so that the point A shrinks down and hopefully point B goes up? Because I think one has to see the current attempts of the North to deglobalize precisely in that context, is the context in which the rich countries were not satisfied with the way that globalization worked for their middle classes, but are unwilling to actually tax the top of their own countries, but would rather derail globalization in the hope that the point B would go up. The situation has not really changed for the middle and for the Western middle classes in the next period of 5 years. And it has not changed even for the following period up to 2018. The situation continued as before, with the one big exception is that the global financial crisis had a significant impact on the global top 1%. Just how significant it is important to realize that 1/2 of the global top 1% is composed of the top of the US distribution, simply because the United States is a very big country, it's a rich country, and it's fairly unequal country. So 11% of Americans are part of the global top 1%. And the top of the US income distribution, particularly the top 1% and the top second percentile, did not have good time during the global financial crisis. So that affected the numbers that you get at the global level. And in some extent, the global top 1% did not recover fully from the global financial crisis until COVID. Now, COVID is a different story. You know, the changes during the COVID period were very idiosyncratic, and so I will not discuss them. So essentially, we have these two periods of globalization, the one which I already explained, which actually both I explained. The first one was the elephant chart. The second one was very similar for the points A and B, but very different for the top 1%. So what was then, I will then skip this part, which explains what happened at the bottom of the income distribution, where basically China vacated the very bottom of the income distribution and made people mostly from the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, fall into that lowest decile, which paradoxically then meant that actually there was an improvement position of the lowest decile. It's kind of difficult at first time to understand. It took, what happened is that the poorest people who were in China, and there were quite a few of them, through growth, and especially through this last attempt to eliminate rural poverty in China, they were actually pushed out of the bottom decile. Well, that meant that people who were above the bottom decile fell into the bottom decile, but they fell into the bottom decile while keeping their previous incomes. So consequently, when we measure the income of the bottom decile, we see an improvement there. But you know, it's a peculiar improvement. It is simply the change in the composition. But what China also did accomplish is that it actually reduced, as I mentioned before, it actually had a very strong effect on relative positions of lower Western income deciles. So on the left, you have a graph which shows you the positions of the Chinese urban deciles in 88 and in 2018. Now, of course, Chinese decile went up in the global income position, which is shown at the vertical axis. It's actually global percentile. Let's suppose you take the Chinese fifth urban decile. Well, in 1988, it was around the 40th global percentile. So it was below the global median. Well, in 2018, it is at the 65th global percentile, so significantly above the global median. Okay, that's no surprise. We know that China grew very strongly, and of course, everybody, whatever decile in China it actually went up. Particularly, it went up at the very top. You notice at the very top, actually, the gap is very large. So in other words, you have the top urban decile in China, which on average is now at the 97th percentile in the world. Now, when this happened, as I was saying in the very beginning, positions of some other people had to go down. And whose positions went down? You look at, for example, Italy, which is really a very good example of a country that has not grown in 20 years. So what happened is that lower Italian deciles went down very significantly because they were in the range where they were overtaken not only by China, but also by other Asian countries. So notice the bottom Italian decile, dropping from 75th global percentile to the 55th global percentile. Very significant drop. Although the real income of the bottom in Italy remained the same. But if the world is increasing at the rate of 5, or particularly Asia is increasing at the rates of 6% per annum per person, if you don't grow, you actually are going to drop, relatively speaking, to the rest of the world. And that particular pattern is shown in all the rich countries. Here you can see it for, I think, Germany. I cannot read the title, but I think Germany is on the left. Well, it's strange that I cannot see the titles. Because they're covered. And then Poland is interesting because you see Poland was really the most successful, so-called transition country with increased position of the upper part of the income distribution, but a declining position of the bottom part of the income distribution. And why is it a declining position? Simply because despite the fact that Poland has grown significantly, the lower part of the income distribution is again within the range of the incomes of China and India and others, where actually the large progress has been made, and these people have also declined in relative position. The country on the right here is Brazil, and I took a different slide. I had a very similar slide for South Africa. The interesting part here is the following. At the bottom, in South Africa or Brazil, there is no change because these people were among the poorest people in the world in 1988 and 2008. So if you're at the bottom of the world, not much of a change for you, you stay there. And there is not much change at the top either, because if you're really sufficiently rich, you are still remaining at that position. There, you are not being displaced by others. But who is being displaced in countries like South Africa and Brazil are the middle groups, because again, they're within the range where Asia plays a significant role. So you can, of course, there are many other countries that they did that. You can actually ask the question, why does it matter if somebody is, let me see how many, I think I should be closing this in 5 minutes. Why does it matter if somebody is really declining in a relative position? To some extent, you might not, well, many of us have no idea what is their relative global position. But there are certain goods that are internationally priced and that would gradually become less accessible to those people who have declined in relative position. You can imagine this could be the iPhones, this could be the World Cup, this would be the special concert. These would be goods. There are goods that are priced internationally. There are goods priced for the global elite, and they would no longer be available to you. So the decline in a relative global position is something that you might not feel, but it is something that is real. However, that change in the composition did not affect, as I already implied, the top 1%. The top 1% stayed more or less as it was before, very heavily dominated by Western countries. We have about 80% of the people there coming from the rich world. You see the United States has the top 12% from its country into the global top 1%, Luxembourg 14%, Switzerland 9%, and so on. And however, for the first time, we have here on, if you look carefully, urban China, because Chinese data come for urban and rural areas separately, and we use two different PPPs. Urban China appears now with something like 5% of the total number of people which are in the top 1%, top 5%, sorry. So actually the US share is, as you can see, still overwhelming, 40%. Germany and Japan are very significant, but for the first time, China is significant too. India is still very small, under 1%. So this is what has really happened. And let me just conclude this. These are things that are dealing with the challenges which currently exist. But the question is actually what will happen in the next 20 years or 30 years, to the extent that we can predict that. So I will finish with that. First, there is very probably increase of global inequality after 2020, not only because of COVID, but also because China is no longer the engine of global inequality reduction, because it has become sufficiently rich that its further fast growth actually adds to global inequality, because it grows fast and it creates large gaps between herself and many populous African countries. So if we really talk about continued reduction in global inequality and convergence in this century, we really have to shift our attention from China to India and Africa. And this is simply a graph showing you that basically when this line is under zero, it shows the China effect of inequality reducing. That effect has now become really zero or even positive. So one has to forget about China as the engine of global inequality reduction. So that in turn means that we have to focus on the African countries. Let me just go to the Africa. Can Africa become a new China? Now, I'm not going to speak of Africa as, there are 55 countries, but if one really focuses on large countries, that's where the action should take place, because it would make a huge difference if countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, South Africa, Congo, Nigeria, Tanzania grow because of the large number of people, and because these are the countries that are expecting, practically the only countries in the world, Africa is the only continent in the world that expects high population growth or positive population growth. But if you look at the past is not giving you too much ground for optimism. I did a very simple calculation. I said, can I find countries in Africa which have had 5 years of consecutive growth, which was at 5% per annum? over the 5 years. So you find basically only one large country, and that's Ethiopia, which had 13 years of such growth. And now Ethiopia, as we know, is in the midst of another conflict and civil war. So the picture is not particularly bright, but then I want to show the last graph about Africa, is that I have to say that we were not, the economists, were not particularly optimistic about Asia in the 1960s and the 70s. People thought Asia is overpopulated, technologically not advanced, and so on, and we were wrong. So, you know, Africa might actually surprise us, might be able to continue where China and India have come, so that actually inequality in the world decreases, but one should not be complacent. The gaps between Africa and the core are very large. You see here on this graph, only 1% of African population has incomes which are above the Western or the global North median income. So the gaps are, you know, as you can see, the median gaps are almost 13 times. And not only catching up, but reducing these distances is going to take time and require a significant acceleration of growth rates in Africa. It requires also a significant decline in inequality, but you know, there, and this is my last point, there we really are facing a conundrum. And the conundrum is the following. If you look at China, China started with very low level of inequality and had very high growth for 40 years, and inequality doubled. But Africa, or African countries, large African countries, take Nigeria, South Africa, Ethiopia too, start already with high levels of inequality. So you cannot say, okay, we are going to improve and accelerate growth and let inequality rise, because it is not sustainable. So the difficulties are then really compounded, and they're also compounded by the effects of climate change. So let me stop here. I don't want to become too pessimistic, but I do think that actually the likelihood of us continuing on the path of convergence seem to me, in light of the most recent development with globalization, climate change, high population growth in Africa, and so forth, to be relatively slender. So let me stop here. Sorry if it took a little bit longer, and I'm really looking forward to your comments.